How in the world is it the year 2025 already? If you want to make 2025 the year you do not visit the ER and you do not pass another stone, make sure to register for my free webinar coming up, How to Make 2025 Kidney Stone Free, on January 9th at 12 Eastern. Head to www.kidneystoneclass.com to register to join live, and be sure to get a link to watch the recording. I hope to see you there.
Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the 74th episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts, as always. And today we have a wonderful question from a listener. So let's listen in.
Hello, I wanted to know.
So first of all, thank you so much for that question. I think it is a wonderful one, and I think one that is very relevant to a lot of my listeners and readers out there. And so I really wanted to tackle it as soon as possible. I do want to give a quick disclosure that I am white. I am Caucasian. I have no Mexican heritage. I have no expertise specifically in Mexican or Latin cuisine in general. However, I do love it and eat a lot of it. And, will do my best to tackle this question to the best of my ability. But I did want to say that I hope to have other dietitians who are not Caucasian, who have a variety of different backgrounds on the podcast over the next year, because I think it is much more impactful, and people who are actually living or have lived in different cultures, and who actually, eat these cultural foods a whole lot more regularly and in a whole lot more traditional a way than I do, is definitely much more useful. However, this question was so relevant, I did want to tackle it as soon as possible because, it takes a while to schedule with other dietitians and record and get it live. So I promise that I will have a Mexican dietitian on sometime in the next year or so, but I wanted to really get this question answered because, again, I think that a lot of my listeners have it. So I want to say that in general, I think that Mexican food is delicious and also a wonderful fit for any kidney-friendly diet, just like any culture, honestly. I think that we have such a sort of whitewashed view of what, quote, healthy food has to look like. And when we think healthy diet, we sort of immediately think like kale and quinoa and like chicken, which is fine. If you love those foods, like that's completely fine. But it is really unfortunate that we immediately think that foods such as Mexican food or traditional Southern foods or Thai food or Chinese food is inherently unhealthy. And I just wanted to start this episode with sort of completely busting that myth that is completely false. Just like any cultural food pattern, there are certainly things that we want to be mindful of when it comes to kidney-friendly eating, right? Like we want to think about making sure we're getting in lots of vegetables, making sure that we're not eating a ton of meat, making sure we're not eating a ton of salt. But this is true for literally any dietary pattern. And so we just need to kind of, apply the same general kidney nutrition principles to a Mexican food pattern like we would any cultural food pattern. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that I think that Mexican food and any cultural food pattern is a wonderful fit for kidney-friendly eating. We just need to, learn about how to do it in a more kidney-friendly way, if that makes sense. But I think diving into Mexican food specifically, I think that there are a ton of ingredients that are commonly used in Mexican food that are fantastic for kidney health. So I want to kind of dive into all the things that I think are really wonderful and things that we might want to really focus on when we think about building a sort of Mexican meal, and then kind of talk about some of the things that we might want to be mindful of. So the first thing, one of the first foods that comes to my mind, at least when I think about Mexican food, is beans. I love beans. Beans are delicious. And beans are actually, can be a really, really great food to include in a kidney stone prevention diet. I know that beans are often vilified because they do tend to have a bit more oxalate in them. But as you know, I do not recommend a low oxalate diet for kidney stone prevention. And this is one of these reasons why. Beans are typically banned on a low oxalate diet, right? However, when you look at the other things that come with beans, and also other high oxalate foods for the record, but beans specifically are a wonderful source of plant-based protein. Things like beans, nuts, and seeds packed with plant-based protein. And plant-based protein does not do the same negative things to your urine that protein from, say, beef, chicken, pork, or fish does. And so I think replacing some of your protein with these beans, which are such a common ingredient in Mexican cuisine, can be a really, really great thing because they can replace some of that animal protein for some of this great plant-based protein. As long as we're getting in enough calcium, typically that sort of cancels out the oxalate and we don't need to worry about it. Obviously, all of this needs to be highly individualized to your 24-hour urine test and the type of stone that you have and all that good stuff. But generally, when we look at people who are eating more beans and other plant proteins from foods like beans, they tend to have less kidney stones. So I think that is one really, really great ingredient that I think we can kind of highlight and eat more of in a sort of traditional Mexican food pattern. Beans are also packed with fiber, and we know we are learning more and more and more about the benefits of eating enough fiber for general health and also kidney stone prevention. There is a paper that came out just this year in 2024 about how just eating, I believe it was 5 more grams of protein per day, just 5 grams. That's like literally the amount that's in like 1 cup of berries, for example, or a half cup of beans for the sake of the bean conversation. Just eating those 5 grams of fiber reduced kidney stone risk by like 10%, like just 5 grams of fiber. That is just one serving of high fiber food, whether it be beans, nuts, seeds, or maybe a fruit or vegetable. So I think that beans are so high in fiber. I think that's another really great benefit. There's also a ton of other great things in beans from a kidney stone prevention. They're packed with potassium. They're packed with magnesium. They're packed with something called phytate or phytic acid, which is a really potent inhibitor of stones. Basically, beans are packed with all of these really, really good things for both our general health as well as kidney stone prevention. And I think especially if we're using these beans as a source of protein at that meal in place of beef, pork, chicken, or fish, or perhaps as a way to eat smaller portions of beef, pork, chicken, and fish, they can be a really, really great addition to any kidney stone prevention diet. So beans is definitely the first food that I wanted to highlight. The second sort of general food that comes to mind when I think of Mexican food is just vegetables, right? Like, from my understanding, Mexican food can be packed with a ton of different delicious vegetables. I think of onions, hot peppers and bell peppers, different chilies, right? Tomatoes, corn, avocado. Who doesn't love guacamole, right? Tomatillos, jicama, cactus, or like all of these wonderful, delicious vegetables that are going to give you a lot of those really, really good things like that I talked about for beans, right? So all of these things are going to give you fiber. They're going to give you potassium. Many of them also give you a little bit of magnesium and also something called alkali to kind of help balance the acid levels in your urine and help us get more of good citrate and other good stuff in our urine. So, and these things are all just so good for us in general, right? Like we know that people who eat more plant-based protein, we know people who eat more vegetables and fruit in general tend to have fewer kidney stones. And so I think that really sort of capitalizing on all of these wonderful vegetables that are commonly found in Mexican dishes is really, really great. And I think one thing I might recommend is really making sure, like any recommendation I make for any cultural diet pattern, right, is to just make sure that you're eating a lot of those vegetables, right? So maybe if you're used to really having a larger portion of meat and rice and maybe a smaller portion of those vegetables, just kind of work on those portions, right? Like still have your meat, still have your rice, but maybe have a slightly smaller portion and really fill up on all these beautiful vegetables that tend to be included in Mexican dishes. The next food that came to mind that I was like, man, like that is really wonderful for kidney stone prevention is fruit in general. I know that fruit, the beautiful fresh fruit that you find in Mexico, is a very, it's just commonly consumed, from my understanding, in Mexican cultures. And fruit is a wonderful thing when it comes to kidney stone prevention. Fruit is packed with, again, those that potassium, and packed with fiber and lots of really good stuff to just help kind of balance our urine acid levels, as well as get a lot of other really good stuff into our urine. So I think that that's another thing in Mexican food patterns that I love. The listener specifically asked about rice and brown rice, and I actually just recorded an entire episode about rice, but I think that rice and other carbohydrates in general are critical on, honestly, pretty much any healthy dietary pattern, but especially for kidney health, because when we think about kidney health, no matter what we're talking about, we're often talking about not eating a ton of protein, right? Like we're talking about sort of a more moderate amount of protein diet, and when we are eating less protein, we need to have carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are going to be a critical food to give us energy, and they're also a critical food to give us that fiber that's so important, and just so many other things. And so I think rice in general can be a wonderful part. You don't have to eat rice, of course, but if you want to eat rice, and especially if it's a critical part of your cultural food pattern, such as it is in Mexican food, I think that it is a wonderful thing, and I think rice, no matter what kind of rice you like, can absolutely be included. In that episode 71, I dive into a little bit more about the difference between white and brown rice, and which one, sort of the pros and cons of each one. But for the purpose of this episode today, I'm just going to say that rice is great on a kidney stone friendly diet, and that either kind of rice can be a great option. So there's a lot of good stuff there, right? Like I touched on a lot of really good things that are foods that you may already be eating in a Mexican food cultural pattern, right? Dietary pattern. And really just thinking about really highlighting these really wonderful ingredients. There are some things I wanted to kind of flag as maybe things that we want to be mindful of. And again, I want to clarify that these are not things that I'm flagging specifically for Mexican food. These are just things that we flag in general. So the first one that comes to mind is certainly salt. Just like any food, we want to be careful with how much salt we're adding. I think especially when sort of most people in the United States at least think about Mexican food or Chinese food or Thai food, we think about it from a restaurant. And no matter what food we're getting from a restaurant, there's definitely a chance that it's going to be a whole lot higher in sodium than when we cook it at home. And so I think if we are getting Mexican food from restaurants, again, just like any food, it's probably going to be higher in salt. So we want to kind of use our tools to help make that a little bit lower in sodium. I have tips and tricks for eating at restaurants and trying to control that sodium, but that's not really specific to Mexican food. One thing that I do think about when I think about a lower sodium diet and Mexican food is that Mexican food has so many wonderful ways to add a ton of flavor that are completely salt-free. Things like chilies and salsas, right? Especially if you make that salsa yourself. Obviously, if you buy salsa in a jar, there's definitely a chance that there's sodium in it. But if you make a salsa yourself, right there, that's a ton of flavor with very little, if no salt. Onions, garlic, cilantro, right? Like these beautiful, flavorful foods that are going to help make your food delicious without adding a lot of salt and help you keep that sodium down. So that's the first thing that came to mind. Is just like any food, we want to kind of be careful with salt, but Mexican food, I think, has a leg up in this area actually, because there's so many beautiful, flavorful ingredients that are commonly used. The next thing that I think about is being careful with excess meat. Again, just like any dietary pattern, for stone prevention, we typically want to be thinking about eating the right amount of meat, poultry, fish, pork, etc. And I think that sometimes Mexican food can be a little bit meat heavy, but that's okay. Just like I kind of mentioned earlier, it's really more thinking about the portions, right? So you still have your meat, but maybe you have a smaller portion. Maybe you up the vegetable component of your meal, making sure you have some of that carbohydrate to help make it a well-balanced meal with that rice or whatever it is. So I'm just kind of wanted to flag that because I know that sometimes certain Mexican dishes can be very meat heavy. So just wanted to mention that. Another thing is tortillas. The listener specifically mentioned tortillas, which I know are obviously critical in Mexican cuisine. And I think tortillas can be a really great source of that carbohydrate. Like I mentioned with the rice, tortillas are a source of carbohydrate. And so I think they can be absolutely consumed. I would be careful, and I know that my understanding is at least that sort of traditionally corn tortillas are used, and that's wonderful because corn tortillas tend to be incredibly low in sodium compared to flour. Flour tortillas are astonishingly high in sodium. One flour tortilla can have honestly up to like 800 milligrams. Most of them probably have more like 300-ish, but a lot, right, for just one tortilla. And corn tortillas definitely are a lower sodium option, so that is one way to kind of help keep that sodium in check. So the next thing I wanted to mention is the type of fat that's used. And again, this is not specific to Mexican cuisine, but generally we want to be thinking about using more oils as opposed to like butter or lard. And so just kind of when you are cooking your food at home, maybe trying to use more healthy oils, so using more oils like an olive oil or avocado oil or even canola oil or something like that. That is going to just, and this is more like a general health thing. This isn't necessarily related to kidney stones, but just kind of from a general health standpoint, I'm kind of thinking about the type of fat used and trying to choose some more of those healthier fats is definitely a good thing, and also kind of an easy swap potentially depending on what you're making. And then the last thing that I wanted to highlight for Mexican food is calcium. Again, just like any dietary pattern, we want to be really, really careful that we're getting in enough calcium. And I think that most dietary patterns do not sort of inherently include a lot of calcium. And so you just want to make sure that you are getting your calcium some way, whether that be via cheese, which I think definitely lends itself well to Mexican cuisine. Obviously, just having a glass of milk on the side, incorporating yogurt somehow. I have other podcasts that really dive into the calcium piece and how to get enough calcium and why that's important. But I just wanted to kind of highlight that because I think that is one aspect that might be missing in sort of a very traditional Mexican food meal that honestly, again, is missing in most cultural foods. Most of our dietary patterns does not inherently include a glass of milk after we grow up for adults, right? I think we think of it more as for kids. But anyway, I digress. Just wanted to make sure that we highlight getting in that calcium, especially if we are eating a lot of these really healthy foods like beans and all these healthy veggies that probably are going to have a bit more oxalate in them. And maybe you could increase your oxalate intake if you are eating more beans and more vegetables, but that's completely fine as long as you are getting in that calcium to kind of help balance it if you do have calcium oxalate kidney stones. So hopefully that helps you know a little bit more about how to eat some of your very favorite cultural foods. You should be eating your favorite cultural foods, the foods that are so central to your being. It's critical that whatever dietary changes you're making, you're able to enjoy those foods because that's life, right? Like these things are so important to you, and it's so critical to enjoy them and eat the foods that you love, no matter what they are. So as always, if you have a question that you would like me to tackle on the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast, I am all ears. I love answering listener questions. Again, as I always say, it is my favorite kind of episode to record. So if you just head to kidneystonepodcast.com, that's KIDNEYSTONEPODCAST.com, you can record your question for a chance to get answered on the podcast. And again, I'm always looking for questions, so I would love to hear from you. So with that, I will end this episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you again next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.